Hi, welcome to another episode of Strategic Insights, providing you with the latest update in the areas of business, technology, and management. I'm your host, Dr. Martin Lockstrom. Let's dive in. Welcome to the edge of tomorrow. Picture this. It's a regular Monday morning. You're sipping your coffee, skimming through the news on your phone, when suddenly every headline, every channel, every social media feed is flooded with a single terrifying word: war. Not just any war, but the kind we thought was behind us. A war that could shake the world's foundations, a potential World War III. It's a scenario that feels almost surreal. But is it really as far-fetched as we hope? In today's episode, we're going to dive deep into what a modern global conflict could look like, how likely it is, which nations would be the key players, and the ripple effects this war could have on humanity and the global economy. Let's start by facing the question head-on. How likely is World War III? To answer that, we have to look at current geopolitical tensions. We live in a world where power dynamics are shifting. The dominance that Western nations, particularly the United States, once enjoyed, is being challenged by rising powers. China, for instance, has rapidly risen as an economic and military powerhouse, and Russia, with its aggressive posturing in Ukraine and growing anti-Western sentiment, has shown that it is willing to use force to push back against NATO's influence. Then, there are other key players: India, which is growing in geopolitical importance, North Korea, with its nuclear ambitions, and even alliances like NATO and emerging coalitions such as BRICS. The world is more interconnected than ever before, but at the same time, these connections make us more vulnerable. The tensions in the South China Sea, the ongoing conflict in Ukraine, territorial disputes between India and China, and the looming threat of nuclear weapons in North Korea all point toward a fragile global peace. The kind of peace that feels more like a thin sheet of ice on the verge of cracking. So, while we may not be living under the immediate shadow of a third world war, the likelihood of a conflict breaking out is not beyond imagination. Now let's talk about who might be involved. The most obvious flashpoints would involve the United States and its Western allies on one side, and China, Russia, and potentially other countries like North Korea or Iran on the other. The US and NATO have long been the leaders of the global order since the end of World War II. But this order is increasingly being challenged. Russia, in particular, has been pushing back on what it views as NATO's encroachment in its sphere of influence, with Ukraine being the most glaring example. The war there has already reshaped European security, with NATO expanding and countries like Finland joining the alliance. On the other side of the globe, China has been asserting its dominance, particularly in the South China Sea. This is a region through which trillions of dollars in trade flows, making it a vital artery for global commerce. But China's ambitions are not just about trade routes, they're also about Taiwan, a small island, but one with immense strategic importance. Taiwan is not only a symbol of democracy in Asia, but also a global leader in semiconductor manufacturing. A war over Taiwan could drag the US and its Pacific allies, such as Japan and Australia, into a conflict with China. We also have the wild cards, countries like North Korea, with its nuclear arsenal, and Iran, whose geopolitical ambitions could spark regional conflicts. These nations might not trigger a global war on their own, but they could certainly play a role in escalating tensions between the major powers. But what would World War III actually look like? We need to understand that this war would not resemble the conflicts of the past. We wouldn't see the kind of drawn-out trench warfare that defined the First World War, nor would it necessarily involve massive global invasions like in the Second World War. Today we have technology that could make a global conflict faster, more devastating, and far more complex. First, there's the terrifying prospect of nuclear weapons. There are roughly 13,000 nuclear warheads in the world today, spread across 9 countries. The mere threat of nuclear war is enough to keep most nations from engaging in all-out conflict. But in the chaos of war, accidents can happen. Miscommunication or miscalculations could lead to a nuclear exchange. And once one nuclear weapon is used, it's hard to imagine the conflict staying contained. Beyond nukes, there's the cyber battlefield. Imagine an attack that cripples entire countries without firing a single shot. In a World War III scenario, we would likely see cyber attacks on an unprecedented scale. Power grids could be taken down, financial markets could be hacked, and key infrastructures like hospitals and water systems could be sabotaged. These attacks wouldn't just come from nation-states, but from independent hacking groups, mercenaries, and rogue actors. The cyber frontier makes everyone a potential target. Now, what about the human toll? We've seen the devastating humanitarian impacts of conflicts in Syria, Afghanistan, and Ukraine, but a world war would take these horrors to an unimaginable scale. With modern warfare's ability to target civilian infrastructure, We would see mass migrations as millions of people flee conflict zones. The refugee crisis in Europe during the Syrian civil war was a glimpse of this, but it would pale in comparison to what a global war could trigger. Cities could be reduced to rubble, much like what we've seen in Mariupol or Aleppo, only multiplied across different parts of the world. Humanitarian organizations would be overwhelmed. Countries already struggling with economic or political instability would become failed states, unable to protect or support their populations. Diseases would spread rapidly in refugee camps, food and clean water would become scarce, and international aid agencies would be stretched to the breaking point. And then there's the economic impact. This is where things get even more complicated. Global supply chains, already fragile from the COVID-19 pandemic and ongoing geopolitical tensions, would be shattered. We live in a world where everything is interconnected. From the food we eat, to the cars we drive, to the phones in our pockets, most of these products rely on parts and resources from all over the globe. Take Taiwan, for example, which produces over 60% of the world's semiconductors. If Taiwan were drawn into a war with China, the supply of semiconductors could be cut off, crippling industries from automobiles to smartphones to military equipment. Shipping routes would be disrupted. Imagine the South China Sea, a vital shipping corridor, becoming a war zone. Trade across Asia, Europe, and the Americas would grind to a halt. The Suez Canal, the Strait of Malacca, and other strategic maritime choke points would either be blockaded or too dangerous to navigate. Oil supplies would be cut off, leading to a sharp increase in energy prices. Countries that depend heavily on imports, such as Japan or many European nations, would face severe shortages of basic goods, food, medicine, fuel. Manufacturing would slow to a trickle as raw materials become scarce. This would cause massive unemployment, plunging the world into a deep recession, possibly even a depression. But it's not just about raw materials and finished goods. The financial system itself could be in jeopardy. In a world where cyber attacks are part of the arsenal, major financial institutions would be prime targets. Banks could be hacked, leading to massive losses of wealth and data. Stock markets could crash overnight, and entire economies could collapse. Governments would likely respond with emergency measures, freezing markets, imposing capital controls, and nationalizing industries to maintain some semblance of order. Even in regions not directly involved in the fighting, the economic consequences would be devastating. Africa, Latin America, and Southeast Asia would see a sharp rise in poverty and political instability as global trade dries up and foreign investment vanishes. Nations dependent on remittances or international aid would find themselves cut off, leading to even more humanitarian disasters. Let's not forget about climate change. In the chaos of war, efforts to combat climate change would take a back seat. Industrial pollution would rise as governments ramp up production of war materials. In some regions, forests could be decimated to fuel the war effort, and the destruction of infrastructure could lead to oil spills, chemical leaks, and other environmental disasters. Any progress made on reducing carbon emissions could be erased in a matter of months, setting the stage for an even greater environmental catastrophe in the years to come. So what happens when the dust settles? Assuming the war doesn't escalate to the point where civilization as we know it is destroyed, the world that emerges would be vastly different from the one we live in today. New powers would likely rise from the ashes. Nations that remained neutral or were less affected by the war, perhaps countries in South America, Africa, or parts of Southeast Asia, could find themselves in positions of influence they never had before. The global balance of power would be reshuffled. The international institutions that were designed to prevent such conflicts, the United Nations, the World Trade Organization, and even the International Monetary Fund, would be forced to rebuild if they survived at all. Trust between nations would be at an all-time low. Economies would take years, if not decades, to recover. And what about you, the ordinary person living through it all? The conveniences we take for granted, fast internet, endless consumer goods, easy travel, could vanish. Life might revert to a more localized, self-sufficient existence. In the aftermath of such a conflict, survival might become the primary concern for millions of people. But here's the question we need to ask ourselves. Is World War III inevitable, or is it preventable? The truth is, war is never inevitable. History shows us that diplomacy, compromise, and sometimes sheer luck have prevented major conflicts from spiraling out of control. The Cuban Missile Crisis, for example, could have led to nuclear war, but it didn't. Cooler heads prevailed. However, in an age of rapid technological advancements and rising nationalism, the margin for error is shrinking. So, As we continue to navigate these turbulent geopolitical waters, the key to preventing World War III might lie in the very thing that has been driving so much of our conflict: our interconnectedness. Nations will need to double down on diplomacy, strengthen international institutions, and perhaps most importantly, learn how to share power in this rapidly changing world. That's all for this episode. If you like it, please subscribe to the channel and hit the like button in order to stay up to date with more awesome contents ahead. Until next time, take care. Bye bye.